Well, good afternoon. At least it's afternoon when I am filming this. It's Monday afternoon, about 2 o'clock, and I want to go over some of the lesson notes for you so that we can skip that time and get that time back valuable to us in our meeting on Wednesday night. Before I get into lesson prep, a couple of things you may want to do is first of all scroll down and you can open up the lesson in another window on your computer or you can print it out. You also have another handout called Getting to the Root, which I've posted below as well. And you can take that and print that out or open it up so you can look at that when we refer to it in just a minute. I also want to talk to you a little bit just about the next couple of Wednesday nights. We've had 3 very good Wednesday nights, great attendance. We have trained a lot of people. I'm not exactly sure what the exact number of those people are, but we have enlisted 23 brand new people. 23 people who before our training was doing nothing and are now committed, signed their name on the dotted line to serve in our Sunday school. And you know, one of our goals this year, number 3, is to increase the number of people who are serving. So praise the Lord, we're seeing those people step up and do things, and I think there's more to come. Now, what's going to happen over the next 2 Wednesday nights is we're going to begin to take the next step of the enlistment goal. You know, my goal, I've told you over and over again this year, is to get each class fully staffed and fully functioning. And we've gone a long way toward that, but there were people who missed the training, so we need to get some makeup scheduled so we can get all of them through the process. And then this next couple of weeks, we're going to spend time and we're going to divide up our groups based on the format that you teach. I'll be meeting with the gender graded one week, with the co-ed the next week. We'll be switching around, doing some things because the needs in each class are different depending on the size of the class. And then the other thing is the application of what we've been talking about, especially on Sunday mornings, how we do the prayer time, things like that, differs depending on the style of class that we have. So I want you to be here if you can, at all possible, these next 2 Wednesday nights. And I'm going to send a note out, but if you want to encourage your teacher assistants, if you have them, it would be wonderful if they were able to join us as well. The other thing that you can really do for me in terms of enlistment is there was a lot of people that attended the training and we haven't heard anything back from them yet, meaning they have not signed that commitment form and turned it into the Sunday school office. You can help me by having follow-up conversations with them. You can give them a call, you can thank them for coming to the training, ask them if they've had time to prayerfully consider and sort of get an idea of what they want to do. If they're interested in serving, they need to go ahead and sign that commitment form and get that turned in as soon as possible. If they still want to pray about it or they're not sure, that's fine. Don't press them. But here's the other thing I don't need you to do. I don't need you to give them responsibilities to begin carrying out in Sunday school positions until they've signed that commitment form and turned it back in. In our meeting this Wednesday night, I'll actually give you a list of who's turned things back into us so that you can be up to speed on that. But you can help me on that. That would really be a blessing. Now, let's talk about your lesson real quick. This past Sunday, we went over the important passage, I think, real important lesson, when Israel rejected God as their king and they requested a king, a human king, to lead them and to judge them so that they could be like all the other nations, so they could be like the people around them. And I hope you had a good lesson this past Sunday. I heard some feedback from a few people that sounded like things went really, really well. This lesson is a pretty straightforward lesson. It takes place a couple of years after the time when we taught our last lesson, and it's when Saul begins to show signs of disobedience to God and when God begins to take his hand off of Saul and his throne and start over with another throne, with David, which we'll get to in the future. So the big idea for this lesson is the idea that God judges sin. I think that's an important point for our people to understand. There's a difference a lot of times in what we read in the scripture and then what we live. And what I mean by that is we read these accounts especially like where we are right now in the Old Testament. We're going to read the stuff that we are looking at in this lesson in 1 Samuel 13 and 1 Samuel 15. And oftentimes they disobey God, and then God immediately judges them. I was reading in my daily Bible reading this morning in Numbers when the people complained against Moses, and God brings them out and consumes them immediately. And I wonder sometimes if it would have been easier to follow the Lord when you saw people around you suffering the consequences for their sinful decisions almost immediately. And we read that in the Bible. We see that even in this account. But our people, I think sometimes we can coast through life making sinful decisions, and sometimes those consequences don't come home to roost for several years, and we can deceive ourselves into thinking that everything's okay. We need to remember and to remind and to drill home the point with our people that God judges sin. We can't get away with it. He's going to expose it, and it has consequences. Now, a couple of things on this lesson that I'll point out to you. One is, we always try to encourage you to use a variety of teaching methods. Obviously, I like to try to aim, if you can, for about 3 different methods a week. The challenge really in teaching is coming up with different ones. Now, you're always probably one of those 3 is always going to be lecture, because that's part of the nature of teaching. So that's probably already taken care of for you. You have this handout this time on getting to the root, okay? Getting to the root. This is a great handout to use. Now, let me give you an idea on how to use it that is a little different than what we normally do with these worksheets. The point of this worksheet is it asks some pointed questions about yourself and how you can come down and begin to identify what is the root in my life of the ongoing sin issues that I have, whether they're lying or lust or greed or jealousy, whatever they may be, impatience, that type of thing. An interesting thing, and boy, teachers, you'll probably get a little nervous when I even bring it up, but you can hand this out and literally give them 5 minutes to work on these by themselves individually in silence. Now, you've already taught the lesson, you've already made the points, and you may not even come back and discuss this, because quite frankly, I don't know a whole lot of people that want to discuss the root of their personal sin in front of the entire class, and that's probably a good thing. And you probably don't want that in your class on a Sunday morning. It would be a great way to shut it down, if you know what I mean. But that would be different, and I think it would. The silence of the room would really make the time, I think, a little bit more meaningful. I was reading in something else today. One of the things with technology is that we're no longer bored. Right? Every time you are tempted to be bored, we pull out our phones and we look at our phones and we get on Facebook or whatever, or we text somebody, or we surf the internet, that type of thing. We play a game on our phones. The problem with that is there's a healthy aspect to being bored. When you're bored, you begin to notice the things that are around you. In the old days, we sat on the front porch, and instead of staring at our phones, we had conversations with people, or we sat on our front porch and we heard the birds chirping and we saw the sunset and things like that. And it's a lot of times that in the boredom and the silence, all right, when we begin to do some deep thinking. So a good idea is to hand this out and say, listen, do me a favor, let's try the best we can to put our phones away. Let's pull our Bibles out, let's pull the handout out, and I'm going to give you 5 or 6 minutes just to work through that on your own, personally, no pressure. We're not going to discuss it unless you want to, but give them that and just let them work on it. All right? So that might be a different, fresh approach to working, to a teaching technique in your class. And then, of course, you also have discussion if you're doing the application and so forth. Now, let me give you a quick little idea of what I do most of the times in my lessons. I usually work through the lessons when I'm teaching the young married. Of course, I got a little different format because I'm the master teacher and we have the table group discussion, so I don't have to do the application. And it's a little different because you don't get a ton of discussion in a large group of 60 or 70 people. But what I try to do is work my way through the story, give the account, draw out the points, read the key texts, sort of outline everything for them. And then before I turn it over to the table groups for application, I like to just say, okay, hey, let's step back for a second. What are 2 or 3 principles that we learn either about God or about ourselves, about the world around us from this passage? And a lot of times I think what that does, I always notice people pull out their pencils at that point and take notes. I think they're looking for small, concise thoughts that they can carry with them throughout the week. I think that's healthy to sort of take the entire story, especially in what we're doing right now, we're covering several chapters a week. So to go through it, to work through it, and then to pull it down real quick and say, okay, here's the smaller, in a nutshell version of what you need to remember and what you can begin to think about in application, I think is very, very healthy. Plus, it serves as a really good springboard into the application section and discussion for your lesson. So let me give you an example. If I was to teach this lesson, we have Saul's choice to disobey, which is point number 1, and then point number 2, Saul disobeys again. Right? We begin to see a pattern in his life. But there's some key passages that are in here. One of the situations where Saul disobeys is he can't wait for Samuel, the priest, so he begins to offer his own sacrifice. And in the second one, he's got commands to utterly destroy the enemy, and he doesn't do that. In fact, it's a great passage. He goes through blame shifting all the time. It's really an interesting passage. But I came up with 3 principles that I think just stand out in these 2 or 3 chapters that we're talking about today. The first one is this, and this was one especially with my younger people, I try to encourage them to put this on the refrigerator and teach their kids. The principle is that partial obedience is disobedience. You've heard that 100 times. But boy, we forget about that. We don't follow directions specifically. Saul needed to offer a sacrifice, but Saul was not supposed to offer a sacrifice himself. Saul defeated the enemy, but he didn't follow through completely and utterly destroy. He kept some of them alive. So we see a very real principle that God viewed both of those situations as disobedience, when he could make the case that, hey, 95% of this I followed through on. The reality is partial obedience is disobedience. That's one principle. The second principle goes along right with it. You'll see that these 3 principles sort of logically line up. Partial obedience is disobedience. Number 2 is God takes disobedience seriously. Once we identify what disobedience is, and we're even thinking in this passage that it's even partial disobedience is disobedience, I think we see in the life of Saul that God takes disobedience very seriously. The key passage there is 1 Samuel 15:23, and that's the famous passage you've heard before where he says, "For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft." Boy, we don't think of it like that. We tend to minimize our sin, and yet here is Samuel speaking to Saul and correcting him, and he relates rebellion to witchcraft and stubbornness as iniquity and idolatry. We don't think of that a lot, but boy, it reminds me that sin is a very, very serious thing, not to be played with, and a great offense to God. So partial obedience is disobedience. Number 2, God takes disobedience seriously. And then number 3, we see in this story that disobedience always has consequences. Disobedience always has consequences. So God begins to remove his hand off of King Saul, and he strips the kingdom from him, so to speak. And so we see that our sin, it offends God, but then there's consequences when we do that. So I think those are 3 principles that you could teach this lesson, come down and make those 3 points, maybe then give them about 5 minutes to do the handout, and then wrap up with 5 or 10 minutes of discussion on the application of the lesson. I think you'll have a really high quality lesson. So I hope that's been a blessing to you, a help to you. And I've got some good feedback. I think y'all like this for the most part. I guess you guys are watching it. But I appreciate you tuning in. I will see you Wednesday night, 6:15. We're not at 6 anymore. We'll be back at 6:15. And I look forward to seeing you and working with you again. Don't forget, pray for our 3 goals every single day. And we'll trust the Lord to keep blessing us as he's done here in recent weeks. Have a great week. If there's anything I can do for you, please give me a call here at the church office, and I am ready to step in and help you any way that I possibly can. Okay? God bless.